So as always, we will endeavor to start promptly. So good afternoon, everyone. This is your COG Board Chair, Christian Dorsey, and I'd now like to call the April meeting of the COG Board of Directors to order. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for our virtual meeting. As we return today to our virtual platform, I request your patience with any technical difficulties that may arise. And in order to facilitate the meeting going smoothly, I ask that you keep your microphones muted. When you would like to speak, please go ahead and unmute your line and then return to mute when you conclude. And please take advantage of the chat box if you'd like to offer any questions or need any clarification from staff or from me while I facilitate the meeting. As always, I'd like for us to begin by reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, and I will lead us in that now. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Before we begin our substantive portion of the meeting, I'd like to have Janelle Partman, who has been monitoring the participants box, complete our roll call to document the attendance of all who are present at the meeting. As a reminder, our meeting today is being broadcast both audio and video through the COG website, live streamed through our YouTube account. So Ms. Partman, will you go ahead and take roll for who is present today?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. From the District of Columbia, I have Eugene Kinlow. Are there any more members from the district? All right, from Maryland, I have Michael O'Connor, Joy Schaefer, Denise Mitchell, Craig Moe, Tara Jackson, Bridget Donald Newton, and Kate Stewart. Am I missing anyone from Maryland?
Tim Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. All right, from Virginia, I have Christian Dorsey, Rodney Lusk, David Snyder, Julie Briskman, Phyllis Randall, Mark Wolf, Daryl Moore, Ann Wheeler, and Andrea Bailey. Am I missing anyone from Virginia? All right, Mr. Chair, we are good to proceed.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Partman. For my chairman's report, I have just a few items. First, I would like to remind everyone to register for COG's Racial Equity Learning Series, a free workshop designed exclusively for local elected officials. Our fellow board members, Vice Chair Kate Stewart, along with Supervisor Rodney Lusk, and District of Columbia Council member and former COG Board Chair Kenyon McDuffie starred in a short video to help us understand the importance of this opportunity. And at this point, we'd like to share that with you now.
There are communities in our region that lack representation, including communities that do not speak English or come from different socioeconomic backgrounds.
A history of racism in our country has led to current day disparities in education, job attainment, housing, and in many other areas.
By centering and advancing racial equity, I think local governments can signal a clear commitment to learn from the past and use all the tools and resources at our disposal to foster racial and economic inclusion in our laws, our policies, and our governing practices.
We want to make sure that all our residents are able to fully participate in the region's economic viability and contribute to its readiness for the future.
We cannot improve equity in our region without collaboration between government, our nonprofits, and the private sector.
So please join us by registering for the first session of COG's Racial Equity Learning Series for an opportunity to gain knowledge, hear from peers, and think about solutions to equity issues in our region.
Thank you so very much for that. Excellent job by Vice Chair Stewart and Supervisor Lusk, as well as Mr. McDuffie. I know this is a priority for all of us in the room, and I hope as schedules as schedules permit, you all will be able to participate in the learning series. So registration is very quick and easy. You can do so at the COG website. That's mwcog.org/equity workshop. No spaces in that URL. Next, I'd like to remind you all to add the COG Leadership Retreat to your calendars if you have not done so already. The dates this year will be July 29th through 30th, and the event will be held in person at our usual location at the Hyatt Regency Chesapeake Bay in Cambridge, Maryland. Staff will be sending registration information for the retreat soon, so please keep a lookout for that. And we'd love to see as many of you as possible for what is always an interesting and, of course, fun retreat weekend. And finally, I just want to note that as there have seemed to have been a number of super spreader events in our region over the last few weeks, I am pleased that today, due to our virtual convening, the April meeting of the COG Board of Directors will not be one of them. Rising case and positivity rates are leading to increased transmission throughout our entire region. Fortunately, we have yet to see a concomitant increase in severe illness or death. I encourage you all to stay vigilant and, of course, to be safe. With that, that concludes my chairman's report, and I'd now like to turn it over to Mr. Bean for any updates in his executive director's report. Mr. Bean.
Thank you, Chairman Dorsey. I'd like to highlight 4 things this afternoon. The first is engagement on Region United, our Metropolitan Washington Planning Framework for 2030. I've appreciated the opportunity to speak to several jurisdictions about our new planning framework. Most recently, I spoke in Bowie, in Manassas Park, Monday evening in Gaithersburg, and last night in the city of Fairfax. Appreciate the opportunity to work together to accelerate action on our shared planning priorities. And staff, if you could link to Region United, I appreciate it. Second is federal engagement, White House Roundtable, and then EPA Summit coming up. Kanti Srikanth and I participated in a series of discussions entitled White House MPO Roundtable, the MPO standing for Metropolitan Planning Organization, with about 15 federal officials to discuss how federal agencies could better coordinate amongst themselves for more synergistic support of metropolitan regions. The vision is the idea of a regional cabinet, if you will. More to come on that, I hope. I also met with EPA Region 3 Administrator Adam Ortiz to discuss the EPA's priorities and how they intersect with our own planning framework. And I promised Mr. Ortiz that I'd plug EPA's Mid-Atlantic Summit coming up on May 25th. So staff, if we have a link for that, if you could drop that, and we will share more information coming up on that. Third, the Think Regionally podcast. A new episode is now streaming and focuses on a key Region United priority, and that's climate. Host Bob McCartney talked with COG board member and Montgomery County Executive Mark Elrich about electric vehicles and alternative fuels, as well as the Greater Washington Region Clean Cities Coalition and the Washington Area New Automobile Dealers Association. If we could have a link for the podcast, I appreciate it. And finally, featuring our COG board and policy committees, I want to take a moment to recognize the work of COG's policy boards and committees under the leadership of your peers from across the region. TPB Chair Pam Sebeski of Manassas, MWAC Chair Takis Karantonis of Arlington, Chesapeake Bay Chair Amy Jackson of Alexandria, CPC Chair Karan Sains of Loudoun, Farm Chair Mary Che of DC, Human Services Policy Committee Calvin Hawkins of Prince George's County, and Region Forward Coalition Chair Brianne Nadeau of the district. You can find more news about these boards and committees in my written ED report and in a link that staff will share. Mr. Chairman, board, happy to answer questions about these or other COG related items.
Thank you, Mr. Bean. Are there any questions at this time? Okay, seeing none, we will proceed. Oops, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wondered, Chuck, in view of the headlines regarding violent crime in the region, if you could schedule something in a future board meeting as to whether there's any regional action of any kind that we ought to be engaged in. Thank you.
Okay, I saw Mr. Bean assent, even though I think he was muted for his verbal response. So thank you, Mr. Snyder. Any other questions for Mr. Bean? Okay, we'll now proceed next with our agenda. And are there any proposed amendments to the agenda that has been disseminated? Seeing no proposed amendments, we will move next to item number 5, which is consideration of the minutes from our previous meeting from the March 9th COG board meeting. And if everyone has had an opportunity to review, I will look for a motion and a second to approve.
Penny Gross moves to approve.
Thank you, Ms. Gross. And who was the second?
Daryl Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Properly moved and seconded. Are there any comments? We'll now move to a vote. Are there any abstentions from consideration of the minutes? Are there any no votes? Seeing none, the minutes stand as approved. We'll move next on our agenda to item number 6, and that is our consent agenda. We have just one resolution on our consent agenda today, R18-2022, authorizing COG to procure and enter into a contract to receive and expend funds for the Regional Catastrophic Preparedness Grant Program. Specifically, COG will procure a contractor and enter into an agreement to undertake tasks to continue building capabilities that support logistics and supply chain management capability for food and water. Can I have a motion and a second to approve this consent agenda item?
Move, Mr. Chair. Seconded by Gross.
All right, that has been properly moved and second to approve the consent agenda. Are there any abstentions or nay votes? Hearing none, the consent agenda stands as approved. Now move on to item number 7. Amendments to the rules of procedure for COG board meetings. As you all are intimately aware, over the last 2 years, our board has been meeting virtually in accordance with COVID-19 protocols. We've also discovered through this process that virtual meetings have enabled better and more consistent attendance by members who, due to distance or schedules, otherwise have found it difficult to meet in person. With that as the backdrop, you will recall that we announced in March that we would propose changes to the rules of procedure for the board to be able to meet virtually. The proposed changes are found on page 15 of your board packet, but in some, they remove restrictions on how often the board can meet virtually so that it can be done expeditiously as long as proper notice is provided to both staff and you as board members. There is a memo that summarizes the changes beginning on page 15 of your board packet. And then there is the actual resolution language, or the change language to the rules of procedure that are found following. So assuming that everyone has had an opportunity to review, I'd like to first open the floor for any questions about these changes. And we have Zach Packard, who is part of the general counsel's team, who will walk us through any discussion on these issues.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Ms. Gross.
Mr. Chairman, I did have a question on these rules of procedure. And I notified COG staff and also Sharon Pandak about my concern, and I believe it's been addressed, but I just wanted to let the board know. Fairfax County is the only jurisdiction that has 3 board members on the COG board. Other jurisdictions have the county executive and office and then a couple of board members, but Fairfax is the only one with 3 members of the board on the board of COG. That can create a problem because, as you well know, Mr. Chairman, in Virginia, you can't have more than 2 elected officials without having, at a meeting without having it publicly noticed. And I was concerned how this might affect Fairfax County's participation. I have been advised by Sharon Pandak that because COG board meetings are not the same as our individual board meetings in our jurisdictions, that we are not at risk here under, even though they've changed the rules again in Richmond this year. But I've been assured that this should not be a problem for those of us from Fairfax County who serve on the COG board. But it is a sort of a reminder that we need to look at how our local regulations may affect our participation in COG. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Ms. Gross, and appreciate your raising that issue and getting clarification. It is consistent with my understanding that notwithstanding any rules for meetings and notice that may exist for you within your own jurisdictions or within the Commonwealth of Virginia, since the COG board is a separate entity, it's slightly different. But Ms. Gross, you raise an important point that whenever you consider changes which seem obvious and common sense on its face, it's always wise to do a comprehensive crosswalk to see any unintended consequences. So thank you for raising that. Are there any other questions about these changes? All right, well, seeing no questions raised, and I don't see any in the chat, at any point, it would be appropriate for someone to offer a motion in this regard to go ahead and approve Resolution R-19-2022, approving revisions to the Board Rules of Procedure, Rule 4.02.
Mr. Chair, I so move. Calvin Hawkins.
Thank you for the for moving, Mr. Hawkins. Is there a second?
Second, Supervisor Bailey.
Thank you, Supervisor Bailey. And are there any additional comments on the motion? Seeing none, I will now call for a vote. And first, we will, excuse me, I'd like to ask that we have any abstentions. Are there any no votes? Seeing and hearing none for both, the motion stands as approved. Moving next to item 8 on our agenda. Transit-oriented communities in Metropolitan Washington. I'd like to invite Mr. Bean, along with COG Research and Data Program Director Tim Kanan, to join us for a briefing on the implementation of transit-oriented communities centered around the 225 high-capacity transit stations in the region, a central component of our planning framework. Mr. Bean.
Thank you. Board material that we will be referring to beginning your board packets on page 22 and include a two-pager from me outlining why we're using the term transit-oriented communities, followed by a memo from Conti, Paul, and Tim with 12 pages of maps and tables. This document was key to our retreat last July, and then a few data points were subsequently corrected with an October date. And this memo provides regional details about the region's high-capacity transit station areas. Following that is the PowerPoint presentation that Tim will walk us through after my introductory remarks. This segment, item 8, is intended to provide some context for the major regional initiatives in item 9 and to set the foundation for a board discussion coming up in item 10. So we use the term transit-oriented communities for 3 primary reasons. First, we say transit-oriented communities rather than transit-oriented development because the ultimate goal is not development, it's building communities. Appropriate development is a means toward that goal. Second, I would associate TOD with a focus on mixed use. This focus helped bring about the change from mid to late 20th century regional planning from in and out spokes, differentiating work and live, that indeed planning could mix these uses in one place, thus mixed use. This idea, once on the fridge, is now at the core. But I would say that through the planning framework, we're seeking both mixed use and mixed income. As difficult as the economics might be, I'd say that we're striving to both preserve and add more housing affordability closer to transit. Third, TOD has appropriately focused on the walkshed, the half-mile radius around a station that if sidewalks are present and there are no natural or human-constructed obstacles, allows for a 10-minute walk, a beautiful full moon walkshed that optimizes the number of people who can access that transit and creates more value for more of the surrounding land area. In the construct we're examining, and with the advent or potential for more mobility technology in the coming decade, we're holding on to optimizing the half-mile focus, and we'll also analyze the question, what would optimize look like for the 1 mile radius, the bike shed, if you will, or even the 2 mile radius, micro transit shed, such as the Flash bus in Montgomery County. Then in item 10, the board will have the opportunity to engage in questions such as, with a shared system like WMATA, that we're investing more than $4 billion in every year, or MARC or VRE, is there a shared responsibility to optimize these walksheds, optimize this land use so that we're leveraging all that we can out of these systems? And with that as an opening, let's go to Tim Canan for his presentation. And Tim and I will be pleased to answer questions and engage with the board after that. So Tim.
Thank you, Chuck. Good afternoon, Chair Dorsey and members of the board. I'm pleased to be here with you today. I have a couple of PowerPoint slides I'd like to walk through if we can get those up on the screen. Maybe we can just start with the next slide, please. So for many years, as Chuck noted, we referred to transit-oriented development, or TOD, as a smart growth concept, promoting balanced mixed-use development around transit stations. However, as Chuck did note, TOD focuses more on land development and the built environment rather than the communities that they serve. Transit-oriented communities, or TOC, means more than just development. It means residents having access to housing affordable at all income levels and family sizes. It means increased access to transit. Workers can reach more jobs throughout the region. And it also means employers can have more access to a larger talent pool. Residents and workers have more transportation choices, and these choices that are more affordable and environmental friendly. It means a blend of land uses and development around transit to promote interconnected activities of living, working, and playing. The built environment does not separate these activities. Next slide, please. The region already has the building blocks in place to promote the development of healthy TOCs. In fact, by 2030, the region will have 225 high-capacity transit station areas, or HCTs as we call them. And these are areas that are served by transit in different modes. These include metro rail, commuter rail, light rail, streetcar, and bus rapid transit. And a key point is by investing in these areas, making access improvements in areas served by HCT, the region can catalyze the development of healthy TOCs in the region. Next slide, please. This slide shows the distribution of HCTs across jurisdictions in the region. Many of you have seen a version of this before, but this has been updated to account for HCTs in more than one jurisdiction. For example, the Greenbelt HCT, which provides both Metro Rail and commuter rail service, straddles the cities of Greenbelt and College Park. That HCT has now been assigned to both jurisdictions in this table, but it is not double counted in the regional total. I know that there was some concern that we were not allocating them to multiple jurisdictions when appropriate in the past. I just wanted to make sure that everybody sees that we've corrected this table. Next slide, please. In October 2021, this board adopted Resolution 46-2021, calling for the region to prioritize HCT in land use and transportation planning to equitably achieve housing, accessibility, transportation, and climate change goals. What this means is that it means providing safe and convenient walk, bike, and microtransit access to high-capacity transit. It means completing the National Capital Trail Network to better connect communities in and around the HCTs. It means taking more local actions to optimize access to HCTs. Next slide, please. So there are lots of opportunities within HCTs. Improvements within them can connect residents to more jobs, and they can connect employers to a wider talent field. These improvements can make HCTs and more broadly TOCs more desirable locations for us to live, work, and play. Access improvements can vary. They can include pedestrian access improvements close to stations that make reaching the transit station on foot more reasonably achieved and safe. Improvements that extend a little farther out from the station itself can increase accessibility by bicycles, scooters, and other activity modes. And extending that circle even farther out, ultimately we can have access improvements that can help stations become even more accessible from farther away using environmental friendly microtransit solutions, those that might be in place now or those that we know are coming, such as automated vehicles. Next slide, please. I'd like to wrap up by just recapping that investing in ACT with access improvements really does align with the planning priorities articulated in our Metropolitan Washington Planning Framework, Region United. These investments promote our goals around equity, transit, land use, and climate. In other words, access improvements around HCTs and promoting healthy TOCs check all the boxes in our planning framework. Chair Dorsey, I know we have some exciting speakers on this topic coming up, so at this time I'll be happy to turn it back over to you, and I'll be available to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Canan and Mr. Bean. And Tim, let me apologize for mispronouncing your last name as I introduced you the first time. I apologize. Are there any are there any questions or conversations on that briefing? Thank you for level setting where we are with this conversation.
Chair Dorsey, I have one question.
Yes, Ms. Randall.
On the map, I think it's page 4 that this map, no, I'm sorry, page 25, the map is on. With the grid that shows like what is metro, what is light rail, what do you all consider, how do you define multimodal? Because I would argue that we have multimodal transportation transit in Loudoun County. So I'm wondering how narrowly or how broadly you define multimodal.
Thank you for that question. That's multimodal. We're referring to those high-capacity transit station areas, which have to be either metro rail, commuter rail, light rail, bus rapid transit, or streetcar. In some cases, I'll use the one here close to COG as an example, Union Station. Union Station is served by more than one high-capacity transit type of service. It's served by both metro rail and commuter rail, and streetcar for that matter. So in those cases, we've color-coded those as multimodal stations, just because they include more than one type of high-capacity transit service offered.
So it wouldn't be a metro rail that would also have a bike path or pedestrian trail, because that's not high-capacity transit. Is that correct?
That's correct. There may be multiple modes of transportation available at that particular node, but in terms of, it really refers to the number of more than one type of high capacity transit that's offered at that station.
Thank you so much for that explanation.
Okay, thank you, Chair Randall. Are there any other questions or comments before we continue?
Ian Wheeler, Prince William County. I have just one. Just in regards to high capacity transit, and I've been bringing this up for 2 years, and I'll continue to bring it up, is that we now have 2 large 2,000 car commuter parking lots that have buses that will be going down the HOV lanes of 66. And we are going to consider those moving forward as not activity centers, but transit centers. And I know they're not on their map, and I know no one's counting them, but the fact that they have 2,000 spots there, I don't know what high capacity, the definition of high capacity is. So I was kind of wondering that also, whether that would qualify, but we are looking at those as transit nodes and planning for micro transit to those locations. I just want to go on the record so everybody's on the same page. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair Wheeler. We appreciate that. I think, as we understand it, wouldn't fit within the definition as defined, but it's important to note for regional connectivity and planning purposes that that's going to be a significant source of achieving the region's transit-oriented community goals. So we should figure out a way to properly reflect that in planning moving forward. All right, Mr. Elrich.
A couple of questions. Well, question and a comment on the high capacity transit. How do you differentiate between, say, a station in Wheaton where there's a relatively urban area versus a bus rapid transit stop on George Avenue, anywhere along George Avenue? Are they both high capacity transit areas?
They are both considered high-capacity transit, and we just differentiate them by referring back to that map. We have the different color codes to indicate what type of high-capacity transit service is offered in those locations.
So what's your definition of high capacity? How often does it have to run? And how big does the catchment area have to be? Because if you do this along large parts of George Avenue or Connecticut Avenue and other places, a half-mile catchment area on a walk shed doesn't yield very many people to start with. And then they would all have to be going to someplace that the bus went in order for them to avail themselves of transit. So how do you define it?
I think there's two questions in there, and the first one, in terms of defining high-capacity transit, is really we just use the mode of service that's offered to define it. If that mode is offered in that area, then we define that station as a high-capacity transit station. In terms of the area that's served by high capacity, you raise a very good point, and that's really the crux of our call to invest in these areas to improve accessibility and walkability. Over on the Transportation Planning Board side a few years ago, we did an analysis of walk sheds where we looked at and compared these areas, the walk shed of these areas, and how far somebody could walk reasonably within 10 minutes or half a mile. That's sort of the standard definition of a walk shed. And we noted that based on the network that was in place, some of those effective walk sheds were much smaller than others because the infrastructure wasn't there to really accommodate those larger walks. In other station areas, there was a good network in place where it really did fill out that half-mile radius. So our call is to invest in these areas and make access improvements to expand these walk sheds and to expand them farther than just a walk shed, but to also include active transportation modes such as bicycles and scooters, and then to think even beyond that in investing in microtransit in these areas. So as we continue to think about these transit-oriented communities and the transit that serves these areas, improving the network around the transit service definitely makes the connections that we hope to achieve here, but that's definitely a call to invest in these areas to expand that walk shed.
I guess I'd love to have a real-time discussion with you about what that actually means in the real world when you look at a neighborhood, because that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and I don't think the capital expenditures that it would take to do what you're talking about are justified by the ridership that is in within a half mile, assuming you could get to every house. But my other question is, I'm a big advocate of bus rapid transit, but I know the difference between high capacity and stops that aren't high capacity. And I don't know how you can just say, because a bus stops on a street, that just because it's a bus rapid transit bus, if it's going to the same place as a regular bus went to, doesn't make it high capacity. My other question is on housing. You guys talk a lot about mixed use.
So hold on.
You want to see what we've done in Bethesda, where mixed use amounts to a handful, 15% of MPDUs, and then the starting price on 1 and 2 bedrooms is $2,500, $3,000, $4,000. So pray tell, how are you actually going to get mixed use communities unless you're going to lay down markers that counties have to actually achieve?
So I would posit, County Executive Elrich, those are somewhat rhetorical questions, or really debate questions here. And certainly we welcome that discussion. And I think later on when we move in the agenda, we'll have a little bit more of a free-form discussion. But unless I misheard you, there's nothing really that Mr. Kanan can really speak to there, right?
Well, they could speak to whether, if you're going to target housing, how you're actually going to achieve the mixed use goal that you're talking about, as opposed to a system of like low income housing mixed in with very expensive housing. How are you actually going to serve the entire range of the population between the two extremes? Which, as I said, I can show you in Bethesda and other places in the county, they're completely left out. Completely. I think you can't discuss housing without talking about who you're going to house and how you're going to achieve your ends.
Right. I think that's fair. And I think as we move on with the
Okay.
next item on the agenda, that discussion is going to be well within order. Mr. Bean.
Yes, I would say that a couple of the key questions that County Executive Elrich is discussing are key items for the board to discuss more in item 10. And that if we're focused on the word optimize, well, optimize might have a context, might be the type of mode. Is there a difference between optimizing between heavy rail, light rail, and BRT? And also context in terms of the inner, middle, or core. So while we might optimize might look different, and that's where we're looking for more policy direction come out of the discussion in item 10.
Excellent. Any more foundational questions thus far before we proceed with some deeper discussion on some illustrative examples? Ms. Perry? No. Okay. All right. I think we're now ready to move on to item number 9. And today we're going to be joined by Purple Line Corridor Coalition, Sheila Somashekar, to brief us on the Purple Line development in Montgomery and Prince George's County. After that, we will have Fairfax County Supervisor Rodney Lusk, who will speak on Fairfax County's Embark Richmond Highway Initiative, and he will be accompanied by Fairfax County's Planning and Development Director, Barbara Byron. So before we hear from Ms. Somashekar, I would like to turn to County Executive Elrich to give a brief introduction.
So Sheila Somashekar joined the National Center for Smart Growth at the University of Maryland in 2020 as the director of the Purple Line Corridor Coalition. And as director, she mobilizes coalition partners to try to realize the vision of an equitable transit corridor. She has over 15 years of experience in community organizing and engagement, and specializing in economic strategy, social justice, affordable housing, neighborhood asset building, and workforce development. She has extensive experience developing community-based initiatives in DC, and New York City has built a reputation for creating successful stakeholder collaborations that result in pathways to employment, financial independence, and neighborhood resiliency, all those things that we need to achieve along the Purple Line Corridor. And so we appreciate the partnership with the coalition and the great work the National Center for Smart Growth at the University of Maryland is doing. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sheila for a presentation on the Purple Line project.
Thanks so much, County Executive Elrich, and to the team at COG for inviting me to present today. Again, I'm Sheila Somashekar with the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, which is housed at the National Center for Smart Growth at the University of Maryland. And you can go ahead to the next slide. Our goal broadly is really to maximize the benefits of the Purple Line transit investment, minimize the risk of displacement, really centering equity in that work. And our equity agenda prioritizes housing stability, economic vitality, and neighborhood livability. Next slide. So the Purple Line itself, as a reminder, it's a light rail project that includes 21 stops that are currently under construction. It will connect New Carrollton on the east to Bethesda, crossing both Prince George's and Montgomery counties, creating new connections to Metro and MARC, and cutting through areas that are currently underserved by transit. And there's a 16-mile corridor that's most affected both by construction in the short term and the longer term economic shifts that will come. So our focus is really looking at the issues kind of beyond the tracks, recognizing that the Purple Line is not just transit investment, it is a community development investment. Next slide. So just a quick visual. This is using COG's maps of alignment with PLCC, with the Purple Line itself, and COG's planning framework. for 2030. There are 21 high-capacity transit stations along the Purple Line. 19 of them fall within 19 of the station areas falls within an equity emphasis area. 19 also fall within an activity center for COG. So this is sort of ground central for where there is opportunity, we think, for long-term alignment with COG's goals. Another just visual, this is a snapshot of the corridor. We think of the corridor as the areas within about a mile of the line. No surprise to most of you, but if you look at the Bethesda-Chevy Chase area, the median income is close to $140,000 a year, where if you look at the International Corridor or Riverdale, New Carrollton, it's more in the low to mid 60s. Bethesda Chevy Chase is majority white, where International Corridor and Riverdale, New Carrollton are mostly are majority black and brown. And so our goal is really how can we leverage the opportunity that the Purple Line presents to really help drive equitable growth and create opportunity with priority for the low-income residents of color and business owners of color along the line. Next slide. So the Purple Line Corridor Coalition was founded in 2013 with its housed at the University of Maryland, but with CASA, Enterprise Community Partners, the two counties at the table at the outset. That has grown very significantly at this point to include dozens and dozens of nonprofits, public agencies, elected officials, as well as private sector partners. In 2017, we released the Community Development Agreement for the Purple Line Corridor, which laid out a broad vision for a community development vision for the Purple Line. And that has since resulted in a lot of mobilization around various community development goals across both counties. And one thing I would say about the PLCC is that the Purple Line investment itself is a bi-county investment. It's by its nature regional, and the PLCC is kind of the one entity bringing both county stakeholders together around a vision for a single corridor. We have a steering committee that includes county agencies, elected officials, local and regional nonprofits, private sector as well. So it's really partner-driven work. Next slide. So our goals really fall into 4 buckets around inclusive and equitable growth. The focus is on small and micro businesses, preservation and growth, workforce development, vibrant communities, and affordable housing. So for the purposes of the conversation today, really focusing a little bit more on the housing and the vibrant communities pieces. Next slide. So on the affordable housing side, what we know is that housing cost burden along the Purple Line corridor, that again is within a mile of the line, is greater than in the Purple Line corridor than in the region as a whole, and that's true for both owners and renters. Rents and home values have been on the rise, and that's particularly true on the eastern ends of the corridor, but it's true across the board. And this is pre-COVID data. There has been so much happening over the past couple of years that really has made that situation worse. So we have a housing action plan that was released in 2019 and was represented work by a number of stakeholders to lay out a vision for how we would get to a zero net loss goal for the 17,000 units that are affordable to households earning under 60% of area median income living within a mile of the line. So the housing action plan includes 12 recommendations to advance production, preservation, rental and home ownership opportunity, as well as housing quality, everything from tenant protections to actual development of opportunities within the pipeline. So we have had a significant focus on developing pipeline. These 2 images that you see here are projects that are in the Purple Line corridor pipeline, and we have an $11 million and growing capital pool managed by the National Housing Trust that is actually working to help fill gaps around capital around projects that we're working to help move along to completion. Earlier this year, we released a 2-year roadmap to address distressed and aging properties along the Purple Line. recognizing that there are unique strategies needed for different types of housing. There's a lot of housing along the corridor that is in deteriorating condition, undocumented residents in many cases. How do you implement these goals without also creating mass displacement, which is what we're trying to prevent? So the Housing Action Plan is a living document, and we're adding on to it and deepening our equity commitment as we go and over time. Next slide. So I'll just quickly mention my colleagues at the National Center for Smart Growth have been working on a pretty significant analytical project that is coming to completion. There will be a report released later this year, so I'm giving you the preview. Probably can't answer a ton of questions about the housing pieces of this, but I want to mention that it's coming. It was funded by Federal Transit Administration. It's a partnership with a number of agencies. And really focused on transit-oriented development, which is the name of the grant. We like the transit-oriented communities framing. It's probably more aligned with how we're thinking about this work, but it's a TOD planning grant that included 3 components. One is really focused on transit-oriented development. One is focused on mobility by various modes along the corridor and 2 Purple Line stations, and the third is around economic development. So next slide. Again, very quickly, the TODQ recommendations. So the first 2 pieces here, residential displacement prevention, are focused on strengthening tenant protections, right of first refusal, rent subsidies, really foundational things to prevent displacement, and it's foundational across all of PLCC's goals. Same for the second, additional resources for affordable housing. That's a key need to make any of these goals happen. The remaining 3 are really the recommendations that come out of some technical analyses that, again, my colleagues were leading around expanding and taking a closer look at inclusionary zoning, increasing density and housing choice near Purple Line stations, including increasing the housing types near Purple Line stations in order to increase density. And then this last one we could probably talk about for a full hour. This placemaking goal is really about these last 3 recommendations are really based on or they're looking at market feasible development. That's what the analyses encompassed. And so the idea here is our position is really, if you can do the things that communities want to be doing to strengthen neighborhoods and build on community assets, while coupling that with aggressive anti-displacement measures, you can make communities stronger as well, while also making affordable housing more market feasible. Next slide. The second set of recommendations are, I think, really aligned with PLCC's Vibrant Communities goal, and they're focused on looking at the Purple Line itself, which is at its core meant to help people move around in the region. So the analyses here, we're looking at how you can reduce travel time, how you can improve the quality of experience of traveling in ways that are not based on automobiles. So this intersection here is at New Hampshire Avenue and University Boulevard in Langley Park. It's one of my favorite intersections as a consumer. Really great small businesses kind of tucked into these commercial plazas. But it's pretty perilous as a pedestrian, and I wouldn't dare hop on my bike at this intersection. So these recommendations are really looking at how you can make the pedestrian and bike experience stronger, both to get to Purple Line stations, but also kind of looking at the network kind of more generally. So the pedestrian accessibility pieces include things like automobile traffic management, improving pedestrian infrastructure, increasing sidewalk width, and looking at land use and connectivity. So these shopping centers are adjacent to, in many cases, residential communities, but it's difficult to get from the residential areas to the commercial areas safely. So looking at the physical landscape and how you can make those connections safer and more effective. Next slide. Transit accessibility itself is also a focus. So looking at Purple Line prioritization and bus service revisions, how can we make sure that connections between buses and the Purple Line are seamless? Looking at the Purple Line service itself, there are certain things that have been figured out and other things that have not. For example, reducing, having shorter headways and having a transferable fare structure to make sure that you can easily go from the bus to the Purple Line to Metro or ride on or whatever the case may be. And then finally, looking at bicycle accessibility. So short-term connectivity and safety, long-term connectivity, looking at short and long-term trips. How can you make bike travel safer and stronger? So these multi-mobility recommendations, we are in the process of looking at how we can actually incorporate that into PLCC's action agenda. There are certain, again, there are some of these recommendations are already in the works. Some of them are plans without a clear idea of how they will happen, and we are working to figure out how we can actually make best use of the Purple Line, looking at equity in particular and how we can focus on the neighborhoods that really stand to benefit the most from the Purple Line investment, but also have the most to lose, and prioritizing improvements in those neighborhoods. So I will close there. I guess I would say in short, the Purple Line, it's a one-shot, it's a multi-billion-dollar investment in the region, and our collaboration with our partners, it's difficult, it's messy to bring folks together around a common agenda, but we think this is the way that we're going to get the best out of the Purple Line for the communities along the line now and in the future. So with that, I'm happy to take questions about our work or where we're headed.
Thank you very much, Ms. Somashekar. We very much appreciate that. If you have questions for Ms. Somashekar about the work of PLCC, jot those down, or you can even put those in the chat. We're going to move into our next presentation just to get both of them on the table before we have a wider ranging discussion. And for that, I'd like to invite again Supervisor Rodney Lusk and Planning and Development Director Barbara Byron.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll start. If you can go to the second slide, please. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about Embark Richmond Highway. So the area in red is the study area that we'll be discussing here today. So as you can see at the very northern tip is the city of Alexandria, the entry point along the corridor into Fairfax County. And as you move down, and you'll see each of those little dots, which are actual locations for transit stations and our CBCs, you'll end up at Fort Belvoir. So the study area is that whole length. And what's important is that many people might not know that Fort Belvoir is our largest employer in Fairfax County with a little more than 45,000 employees. Additionally, as you look at the Richmond Highway corridor itself, it has the highest transit ridership of any facility in Fairfax County, with about 5,000 daily riders and passengers each day. And the corridor, just for a little background too, is a very diverse corridor. It does have some economically disadvantaged areas. And if you look at the 2020 median income, we'll see that along the corridor, it's approximately $70,000. But when we look across Fairfax County, it's more like $127,000, so almost a $60,000 variance. And then the other point I'll make is that more than twice the number of households are transit dependent than any other place along the corridor. So we'll go to the next slide. So what's the current kind of economic picture? And this is kind of a interesting thing to look at. We've had no new office development along this corridor in over 30 years. Most of the corridor is, expressed by retail, business services. You'll see a number of strip centers, similar to the one that you see in this photograph on the top and also on the bottom. You'll see large parking lots that face on Richmond Highway. You'll see the buildings recessed on the sites. And you don't see these sorts of developments in kind of our northern and western parts of our county. And there has been different investment levels that have gone into those areas. And I'll say, as a person who formerly worked in economic development, trying to attract companies to the county, we were able to, get companies like Microsoft, get companies like Capital One, companies like Amazon Web Services to make a decision to locate in the northern and western parts. We could not get them to consider the southeastern portion of Fairfax County. And I think a lot of that has to do with the lack of investment and then the planning that was done in this area. So as a result of that, we made the decision to look at the planning. So you can go to the next slide. So we looked at the comprehensive plan as being the foundational way for us to express the vision for the future and then really talk about what the growth could be along this corridor. We also have been really focused on looking at ways to diversify the businesses and the different types of uses that are along the corridor. And we've really tried to express and establish the guidance that we want transit-oriented development around each of these little metro, around each of these bus rapid transit stations. So you'll see in the circles each of those stations delineated here for your use and for your awareness. And then the last point I'll make on the slide is that we're trying to create a Main Street feel for Richmond Highway. The hard thing is that most people are driving through it very quickly from one end to the other. So we've got to figure out how to establish kind of a there for the highway and for people to be able to understand that there are things along the corridor that they might want to kind of stop and participate in. And I'll just make a couple of other points. There are 9 proposed stations along this this route. 4 of them will be transit oriented, specifically the station at PennDOT, the station at Beacon Hill, the station that's a little bit further south, which is the Woodlawn and the Hyder Valley stations as well. So we can now move to the next slide. So as we look at the comprehensive plan and really thinking about the vision for the future, we've had a number of guiding principles for us here, and to think about, getting the community engaged and helping learning from them how we should program the future of this area. We wanted to also concentrate all of our redevelopment potential in the areas where there will be transportation improvements, and those will be aligned to what we call our CBCs, which are our commercial business centers. We want to also rebalance this mix of uses, and that means you've got to have more than just retail uses along the corridor. You need to add residential, you need to add hotel, and you also need to add office where appropriate. It's not going to happen in every location, but we do want to have a substantial mix of uses as well. And then this idea that we don't want to have people all dependent on getting in their cars and driving along the corridor. So we need to have multimodal transportation systems and options. And then the last thing, which I think is important on this slide, is that each of the CBCs needs to have its own distinct character and its own distinct kind of flavor, so that we can encourage people to kind of come in to these areas and to be kind of drawn to them. So if you look at this rendering on this slide, very different than that first rendering where I showed you the existing conditions, because you can see we don't have parking right up front, which I think is kind of critical. And then looking to encourage kind of pedestrian accessibility, and then also to have green spaces and places where people can congregate and kind of be drawn in to the facilities. So we can go to the next slide. So really with Embark, we have to also think about One Fairfax, and we have to think about those communities that have not always been represented and those that have been marginalized in a number of ways. And the key point here is that in the investment arena, we have to be very focused on deploying our resources in areas that are high need, and then also in areas where we have a high transit dependency. And clearly with the Richmond Highway Corridor, we meet both of those thresholds. Housing affordability, I know we were talking about this in the last presentation. This one's tough, and I got to be clear in saying that we're looking at ways to use inclusionary zoning to help us get affordable units and workforce units, but we have to be dogged on this issue of preservation and no net loss. And we talked about this a lot when we were discussing the future for Embark, and I'll be clear, I was a member of that Embark study team. We spent 3 years working on this, and I'll say, this is where the rubber meets the road, is how do you ensure that you're not displacing lots and lots of people as a result of this future redevelopment. And we've said, as we look at the future redevelopment, we have to ensure that if we have 50 affordable units on the site today, that we've got to figure a way to ensure that we have at least 50 units on the future site that are affordable So that if folks want to come back and live in the new community, they will have that option. Additionally, we've got to think about sustainability, and these are issues around stormwater and making sure that we're preserving our streams, that we're using green building practices, and really kind of addressing some of the lack of investment over time. And then last, I'll say, thinking about recreational uses and giving people opportunities to congregate. And I'll say along the corridor today, we have very few of those opportunities. And the idea that you could have people kind of walking in the way that we see in this depiction is stark and different from the situation that we have even here today. Let's go to the next slide, please. So again, on One Fairfax and Embark, this idea about pedestrian safety, and I'll say and suggest this one's kind of tough in that as the Board of Supervisors member who represents the western side of Richmond Highway, I get calls pretty much throughout the year, and invariably I'll get either 4 or 5 calls a year saying that someone has been struck and killed on Richmond Highway. This is one of the deadliest roadways in the whole Commonwealth, so clearly pedestrian safety, looking at ways to address that are going to be pivotal and important in the work that we do moving forward. And then here I've mentioned a project called, it's kind of in the workforce and investing in a residence area. This focus here is in trying to help in a significant community of disadvantage, which is along Richmond Highway behind the Costco. So if anyone's been the Costco on Richmond Highway, there's a Walmart that's also adjacent to it. Behind that Costco is 700 units of manufactured housing, mobile homes. There's another 91 units at the front of the entrance to that site. And then there's about 5,000 apartments and other housing that's available to individuals who have, some of the toughest challenges in our county. And we've made a commitment, and I started this 2 years ago with the help of folks like Penny and the rest of the board to create a workforce center that will be focused on workforce innovation and skills and employment. So we're going to be working with Amazon, we're going to be working with Inova Hospital, we're going to be working with Dominion Energy to train people and move them into jobs that will give them the opportunity to move into the middle class and not be dependent on services going forward. So that's one of the initiatives we have that's in the One Fairfax bucket. Next slide, please. Try to speed it up here. So this is moving back to the transportation discussion. Just wanted to give you a little preview. This is the system that will be our bus rapid transit system. This is what the branding and this is what the logo is for the bus. We're excited about this. It'll be fast, it'll be reliable. We'll have great frequency associated with it. We'll have real-time bus tracking so people can know when the bus is coming. This bus system will be in a dedicated lane in the center of Richmond Highway. It's going to have, buses that are designed for comfort and high quality. And what I also want to note is, we're going to have fare collection that's going to be similar to what we see in the Metro Rail system. And we'll have headways that may be as frequent as every 6 minutes during the peak time period. So this should help us get people to use the service and help us grow ridership over time. Next slide, please. So here I just want to show very quickly existing shopping center that's called the Beacon Mall Shopping Center. This is the one folks are kind of familiar with. It has a Lowe's, it has Chipotle's on one end, and it's got a Damon's and or Dave's barbecue on the other. So this is basically a series of retail boxes and lots of parking in the current configuration. What we'll see in the future is that we will have a mix of uses at this facility. We will have, higher densities concentrated as we get closer to the individual station location. We'll have a grid of streets, which are very pronounced as a part of this. We'll also have the park facilities, so the urban park features that I think are really important. And the thing I like is that livability spine that goes parallel to Richmond Highway that's down the center of the project. and it kind of functions like a main street for each of the CBCs that will be created. But this is just one example. Next slide, please. So with this slide, you can get a sense of how we're establishing some of the placemaking and community building components. So this ecological spine, which I really kind of appreciate the idea here, is that we will take streams that have not been daylighted and store them back to their original condition, and then add additional vegetation, and we will have, you know, open space and amenities that residents can access and members of the community will certainly be able to enjoy. The livability spine, which we talked about in the previous slide, as you can see, pedestrian friendly, pulls people in, really makes for an opportunity for them to be captive and animated in the space. And the legacy corridor is thinking about some of the historical resources that we have, like Gum Springs, and having like trails and other markers that we can delineate to, you know, support and express that great history here in Fairfax County. Next slide, please. Quickly on this one, our transportation improvements through VDOT are going to be pretty significant. This is a 3-mile widening, which will cost about $415 million. We have an anticipated completion date of 2026. I want to say I'm not sure if that's going to hold exactly because I've seen how dates do change, but that's what we are. I've been told as of right now. Our BRT sections, both 1 and 2, are in total length 7 miles, coming from Huntington all the way down to Fort Belvoir. That project's about $795 million, and the completion date anticipated is 2030. I'll just make 2 quick points here. The future extension of BRT to Woodbridge is a possibility, depending on how the BRT goes here in Fairfax County. And then I'll say, you know, with great anticipation, and I would say this would be awesome if we're able to achieve this extension of the yellow line from, you know, Huntington all the way down the Highway Valley. And then if we're smart, we should get it to Fort Belvoir. As you heard me say at the very beginning of the presentation, the largest number of employees of any place in Fairfax County, there's at that base at Fort Belvoir. Next slide, please. Here, I'll just note, you know, the BRT is helpful in helping us to upgrade the image of the corridor. It's going to help us, you know, in dealing with the balance of creating what I want to call a main street and a character for that main street, which is Richmond Highway, and making sure we, you know, have places where people want to kind of get activated and go into, as opposed to just speeding through the corridor. And then, you know, lastly, I'll say the station locations and the land use goals need to be, you know, specifically located where redevelopment potential is the most viable. And we've been focused on that as a part of this research. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will conclude my remarks, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lusk. We very much appreciate that deep dive into the Richmond Highway plans. And at this point, let's have some questions and discussion for either Mr. Lusk or Ms. Somashekar. We'll begin with board members from Maryland. Okay, I see Mr. Elrich. You're muted.
Yep, sorry about that. On the Richmond Highway piece, how are you redesigning the road? I mean, I think what do you have, like a 6-lane cross section right now? So how are you getting in 2 lanes of BRT? What's your plan?
Well, we're gonna have to do some takings, obviously, right? So you're gonna have to widen the length of the roadway in order to accommodate the additional capacity for the bus rapid transit. But we're also going to be adding additional sidewalk areas, bike trails. I mean, this facility is going to be pretty significant. And I think you heard me make the point earlier. This is one of the deadliest roadways in the Commonwealth, and we've got to figure out how we reduce the loss of life, and we've got to be building in those pedestrian safety features at the point that this is delivered. Because we can't have, after making this level of investment, over $1 billion, we can't continue to have this loss of life going forward.
Okay.
Okay. Love
I
to
see.
talk to you more about it. I really appreciate your work there.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Excellent.
And I'm sorry,
Right.
Barbara Byron is here as well, Christian. So if she wants to jump in, I'm happy to tag team it with her if she wants to add any comments after or before. We can figure it out.
May I respond to the last comment? We started out with the
Sure.
road improvements on saying that we were not going to increase the road right of way from what it is today. We might have to do it in little bits and pieces, but in general, we wanted to create the complete streets out of the existing right of way. So part of that included taking the service drives, and another part included reducing the lane widths. Thank you.
Cool.
All right. Next, I saw Mayor Newton.
Thank you, and I apologize for my hand waving. I was trying to raise my hand and I hit the wrong thing. Mr. Lusk, thank you so much for that presentation. It resonates greatly with me for the city of Rockville and what we're trying to do here. And I appreciated the comment that was just made about not widening the road. I feel strongly that the more pavement we keep, the less people will use transit. It's just sometimes more selfishly easy to get in your car and go where you want to go. So I very much like losing those access lanes. Bring your buildings up to the curb and have wide sidewalks. That will help so much. Having ridden on Richmond Highway, trying to avoid the backup on 95 a couple times in the last several years, I like what you're thinking about bringing back the community and whatnot, and we're trying to do that here in the city. So I just wanted to say, go for it. I really appreciated the thoroughness of your report, and if we could get a copy of that, I would appreciate it.
Yes, ma'am. No problem at all.
Thank you.
All right, terrific. More comments from members from Maryland. Okay, we'll move next to Commonwealth of Virginia. Any questions or comments? Supervisor Bailey.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. This was a wonderful presentation, and it partners with an area. I can just resonate with an area in southern part of my district, closer to Quantico. So Rodney, when you mentioned Fort Belvoir, and I know Beacon Hill, it's the same kind of feel that I have in my district. And so you also mentioned a part that it could partner with Woodbridge. So that's coming into the Prince William County area. Can you kind of briefly describe what that looks like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is for us to kind of build out the infrastructure here with the bus rapid transit in Fairfax. But as we kind of see how the ridership and development of the Embark goes, I personally think, and this is something that we've talked about, that this could logically extend into Prince William County. And I think we can certainly start having conversations about it if you'd like. But I think we've got to probably move out first in Fairfax, kind of where we are with our model. And then I say, looking to extend it makes sense to me, because we know how many people are driving from the south into our area. And we know a lot of those folks are actually coming in the Fort Belvoir as well and going other places north.
So Rodney, the other question, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
Please.
Again, the other question is, when you talk about Fort Belvoir, do you see a partnership there in terms of community, the build out in respect of that? Because some of the conversations that I'm having with Quantico is a partnership.
Yeah, we've been meeting with the base for a while. We've got pretty good relations with them, but they do have their own master plan. So I'm going to be perfectly frank here, and I can maybe turn this over to Barbara as well. But they are in the process of looking at their own master plan. And I will say we sometimes maybe we're not exactly 100% aligned always in some respects, because they might decide to put some uses on their property that we might think would be better if they were outside the base. So I think, we have to continue talking with them and figuring out, long term, how we kind of build the infrastructure along the corridor that's going to support and help them. But then the actions that they're taking on the base will also be supportive and helpful to us.
Excellent vision. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So I'd like to pose a question to both Mr. Lusk, Ms. Byron, and Ms. Somashekar. So you both, first, let me just say to each of you, I love seeing projects and visions that reflect what we've coalesced on around COG and as it relates to equity, specifically the equity principles writ large that are informing both of these efforts, but also in the case of the purple line, the specific equity emphasis areas connection. So within that, you both spoke to anti-displacement as being priorities. And there's two ways of thinking about anti-displacement. There's the policy wonk way of sort of no net loss, looking corridor wide, making sure you do no overall harm. But then there is the specific basis of actual families who may be subject to displacement. And I'm wondering if you've thought about how to ensure that while you're pursuing that overall goal, an individual family who may be subject to displacement pressure might have an ability to stay within the same school district, the same job opportunity area while you're pursuing this redevelopment. So I'd love to hear from both of you on that. And why don't we start with Ms. Somashekar if we can?
Sure, yeah, that's something that we think and talk about every day, just this tension between the short term and the long term, and there aren't easy answers. It was the impetus for us creating a working group to really look at the issue of distressed and aging properties, because I think we recognized that if you just use the traditional tools of affordable housing and looking at the composition of both the housing types and the residents along the corridor, there's a lot of immigrant residents, you know, documentation is an issue, and really trying to hone in on what is the strategy? How can we improve housing quality and quantity while also not creating displacement as part of that? So the report that we released in January, that's in the chat and linked, a piece of it is looking at financing tools that you can use regardless of documentation status. Some of the federal tools you really can't do that with. We're, you know, planning a workshop at some point in the months ahead around how you around what we're actually going to do. Let's say a development comes up for sale, or what, you know, how do we enact the recommendations that cover financing, policy, organizing? All of those are parts of the strategy to really prevent displacement. But what do we do? Is it like, you know, you have another development that you're working on where you can rehouse people locally? To your point, you know, displacement is not just about getting people into any units, but it's about the neighborhood connections and all of that. So I would say we've started down that road and we're thinking about it. That report was a step in that direction, but the answers are not simple, and we'll keep you posted if we get it all figured out.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Mr. Lusk.
I'll defer to Barbara if she wants to go first, and I might add something after.
Okay, thank you. So the first thing I would say is, as Supervisor Lusk said, right now we have a preponderance of non-residential development on the corridor. So there will not really be residential development and people displaced. However, we are worried about the displacement of our businesses. And so we're working hard in partnership with our own staff and with VDOT to develop relocation plans for the businesses. On the residential side, the board has recently, in the last few years, initiated a task force that has created recommendations on preservation. My department and the Department of Housing and Community Development have worked closely with the community and the board to develop policies on preservation. We're now coming forward with a plan amendment that would embody those, and we will be monitoring that extremely closely. In addition, I think, as Supervisor Lusk mentioned, any new residential development that comes on board will have a percentage of the units for affordable dwelling units. In addition, we have an ongoing working group related to our manufactured housing. Fairfax County has 8 manufactured housing sites. 6 of them are in Richmond Highway Corridor, and these are areas that really need special attention. So we're working as we speak on figuring out how to best deal with not only protecting those homeownership opportunities, but also if there are impacts to them, how we can assist in relocation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have not had this opportunity to discuss this with my colleagues on the executive committee or Mr. Bean, but given that there are a number of jurisdictions that are, you know, probably subject to increased anti-displacement subject to displacement pressures and desiring to seek anti-displacement policies and programs, we might want to think about convening sort of an informal group of those similarly affected jurisdictions so that we can share some ideas, thoughts, and best practices. And I will work to facilitate that in the coming months. Are there any more comments from members from Virginia? Okay, I'll circle back to Maryland because I see Vice Chair Stewart with her hand, and then we'll get to questions and comments from members from the district.
Thank you. Chair Dorsey, I just wanted to underscore what Ms. Somashekar was saying regarding the displacement. As Tacoma Park is very close to and will have a Purple Line stop. One of the things that we have found and why the Purple Line Corridor Coalition is so important is about coordination between different entities to actually make sure that families aren't being displaced. This takes our local government, it takes our nonprofit, it takes our landlords and developers all to be working together. And we have seen this in Tacoma Park when we have buildings that are being rehabbed, is that we work closely with organizations to make sure that for the short term, families are placed as close to the community or in the community in other apartments or other places. And it's a big undertaking. It's not something that is easy to do. And that is why it really does take coordination among all the different entities. And I just want to thank so much the Purple Line Corridor Coalition for all their work they're doing in bringing folks together because that's how we're going to get this work done.
Thank you.
And I will just say Tacoma Park is an incredible partner across both the housing and small business side. So we appreciate the partnership with the city.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from members from the district?
Just one comment, and I just want to appreciate the presentation, particularly on Richmond Highway, the unified corridor concept, bridging together all those communities that I know very, very well and trying to unify them. It's very exciting. So I look forward to hearing more about how you manage that process.
Excellent. And so at this point, I actually have a list of a lot of questions, but to make sure we accommodate time for our last section, I'm going to cut this short now and invite everyone to follow these projects and to dig a little bit more deeply into them. We've already populated, thanks to Megan Goodman, the presentations from Ms. Somashenkar, but I encourage you to follow the Purple Line Coalition's work. And I think we're going to get out the PowerPoint that Supervisor Lusk presented so that everyone has that as well. These are really going to be two transformative long-term changes to our region, and it's great to see the plans being so comprehensive to benefit the broader community. We know that there's a lot of work that's left to be done with implementation, so we need to figure out how to support you in that work, but we thank you so much for giving us a taste of them today.
Thank you so much.
With that, thank you. With that, we're going to move to the next item on our agenda. And so I'd like to queue up Mr. Bean to be ready for agenda item number 10, where we're going to have a discussion on the regional commitment on connectivity to transit-oriented communities. So we'll start with a briefing, and then there are going to be some key questions that I'm going to ask you as the board to consider so that we can prioritize and give some clear direction for how we pursue this work. But with that, Mr. Bean.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Next slide, please. I think my task here is to get out of the way as fast as possible so that you all can engage in this conversation. And I think it's the handoff between technical analysis and policy analysis, policy making in each jurisdiction, and a policy making across the jurisdictions. What kind of common commitment do we have to these goals? So next slide, please. This has a lot of detail. I think we'll mail this out rather than me hitting it. Let's go to the next slide, please. Part of the focus on these 225 places is if you take the half-mile radius walk shed across all of these it's just 10% of the land mass. But we forecast that 40% of the future population growth will be in this 10% of the region's land mass. So it's important to accommodate the growth. From an economic development perspective, or our socioeconomic development goals, 55% of future jobs, 55% of future job growth will be in just 10% of these regions, of this region's landmass. So this includes WMATA, MARC, VRE. A couple months ago, you heard from Prince George's about the Blue Line Corridor, and that's the import of the Blue Line Corridor to its economic development platform. Next slide, please. This is our dartboard. So optimizing the half mile, mile, and 2 miles. I think the word optimizing, probably add another word to that. Optimization may require customization. So Supervisor Lusk, even the differences between the stations in Embark Richmond Highway, I think Sheila would probably say the same thing about Purple Line. So optimizing with customization in different contexts kind of sets up the discussion now. But these discussions as thought leadership that you all are engaging in does have impacts. I'm aware that the chair and the vice chair of NVTA, Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, are here, and we know that they integrate these ideas in their deliberations and working with peers about where funding ought to go in the future. Next slide, please. Next month, we'll have a briefing from WMATA on their brand new Joint Development Strategic Plan. And we're happy that in the release of their report, they're overlaying a lot of these same concepts. So I would characterize my listening about the plan as the most assertive that we've ever seen, perhaps. Most assertive we've seen certainly in a couple of decades, with the green dots focused on the future joint development stations, and WMATA calling out the equity emphasis areas. So that's the nexus that we're looking for, the high opportunity areas and emphasizing the high need areas so that they're included. So I think, Mr. Chairman, the next slide tees up the three questions that I would imagine that you'll be facilitating the board on. If we were to aspire to optimize, how do we account for differences in type, heavy rail versus BRT, and setting? Chair Wheeler, we're very enthusiastic about the development and the plans around the VRE station, but we understand that it might be different. Given the collective investment, getting as many people on transit, not on the Beltway, given the $4 billion that goes into WMATA, the collective investment in MARC and VRE, is there some kind of mutual responsibility to make sure that we're optimizing the connectivity and land use? And then what should we do about it? So, Mr. Chairman, I think we'll bring that slide deck down and turn the rest of the meeting to the board discussion.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bean. Actually, if I can ask for us to put just that last slide up again, just so everyone has fully absorbed the questions that I would like to guide discussion around. And we're not going to be iterative and take these in sequential order per se. You're free to comment on any that you see fit. But really, we want to gain some clarity and walk away with some consensus understanding about how we feel about transit-oriented communities and our particular role as a COG board in pursuing this vision and what that looks like. So digest those questions for a moment, then we'll take it down and engage in discussion. Earlier, County Executive Elrich voiced a couple of very relevant questions and concerns around this issue. And so I'd like to invite others to join that conversation. So why don't we take the slide down and I can see everyone and hopefully facilitate a discussion given our virtual platform. Well, I'll start off since you look to be a shy, reticent group today. Actually, Vice Chair Stewart, go ahead.
I was just going to start off and say, I think that the second item on that list regarding areas that were straddled different jurisdictions, I would say, given the mission of COG and who we are, that is actually a place that we could prioritize moving forward and bringing the different jurisdictions together to help facilitate that. It seems like that is a natural place for us as COG to actually have a role. And I know, working with my colleagues in Prince George's around our Purple Line and station, other things, working with COG staff and others would help facilitate setting up meetings, moving forward with conversations. I think that would be a useful thing for us to do.
Okay, so having COG facilitate those bilateral, that's the appropriate word, efforts to ensure that they proceed apace. Excellent. Mr. Adams, did I see your hand? Nope. Okay. So one of the questions that Mr. Bean led off with is really, what does this optimize mean? Like, how should we really think about that? And does the type of transit station, does the location of the facility, inner core, outer, are there other characteristics that are really important for really putting some meat on what optimizing means? And that is a question. Mr. Eldridge, you're muted.
You'd think I'd be used to this by now. I says that the question is, how does this fit with already existing plans? So Montgomery County, the numbers projected for 2050, which aren't changed by, for example, by Thrive, they're all accommodated by the existing zoning that we've planned for the county. And we put a lot of work into planning zoning around Wheaton and Glenmont and all these other places for high capacity, right? And they're often stations that are served by buses or transit that could go in multiple directions. So when you start looking at high capacity transit areas and defining every BRT stop along the way as a high capacity station, and then talk about building up around it to provide more volume, if the total number is the same, all you're doing is taking development out of places where it was planned in the urban centers and sending it off to the sides of roads. And you're forcing us to build infrastructure. My stormwater system could never deal with, apartments along all of Georgia Avenue and paving over all the green space. So you create a whole bunch of infrastructure problems that don't exist. We've already planned for people. So I don't understand where we went from smart growth around stations to just high capacity any place there's a bus stop. It's not logical to me. It's not logical environmentally. It's not logical in terms of like Wheaton and Silver Spring. You name the urban area, I'm sure it's true for everybody. Here you've got all these amenities packed in, libraries, stores, jobs, all that. And you're going to delocate the people from there and put them along the road?
So I'll just stop you there, just because I think I can dispel what might be a foundational perception in your comments. The idea here is not to direct and be prescriptive for jurisdictions to shift their already existing plans towards this paradigm. But if we could use the Fairfax County example on Richmond Highway that we just saw, their vision for BRT is to center around stations the creation of transit-oriented communities and associated investments in infrastructure and changes in planning that accommodate that use. In Montgomery County, your BRT stops may serve a different function and may be viewed differently and may not be necessary to accommodate the growth that you foresee. And so I think that's the essence of this question that we want to get at. We've talked about this broadly. How do we need to refine it so that it is most helpful to reflect all of the jurisdiction's concerns? And what I'm hearing from you, not to put words in your mouth, but we have to really think about optimizing as being context specific as it relates to the existing plans or the desired plans for a jurisdiction, which I think, not to speak for staff, I think that's consistent with how they approach it.
I just say that if I was doing BRT up Georgia Avenue, I wound up in Aspen Hill where there's a shopping center on Georgia and a large expanse of concrete. That makes some sense. If I'm in Georgia at Dennis Avenue or farther back and there's a bus stop there, saying, well, we're going to do this here and here's a neighborhood and that doesn't make sense. And it doesn't add. I can't build the richness of things you're trying to build at a neighborhood level that I could build at an Aspen Hill level or a Glenmont level for that matter.
Understood. Thank you. All right, so I think we got one thing, like optimize is got to have a little bit more granularity than just simply being around a station based on its typology. There's a further description to that typology that matters. If there's just simply a place for people to board and get access to the transit facility, that's different from places where you're changing or have the land use available to accommodate housing, a mix of uses, et cetera. So that's helpful. Thank you. All right, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you very much. I'm frankly very supportive of the general approach here. And we've got two projects in Northern Virginia that I think are particularly great examples of this, among others. The one is the West Falls Church area that involves Metro, Fairfax County, the city of Falls Church, in acres of development where that will be truly mixed use, experimental transportation elements through a smart transportation grant. So I think that's an excellent example of how before the shovels go in the ground, how planning can lead to exactly the kinds of outcomes that you're talking about. The second one is the Route 7 Bus Rapid Transit Project, which would run from Alexandria through the city of Falls Church to Tyson's Corner, literally linking hundreds of diverse residential areas and businesses and providing significant congestion relief. So that's another example. And these are just two. If you go from general concepts to what does this look like, I think this is a very exciting time. These are very exciting principles. And I think in both cases, these are pretty good examples in the works of how to do what the board is trying to do. Multi-jurisdictional, as you know, Chairman, Arlington is very supportive of bus rapid transit, Fairfax County, the city of Falls Church, Alexandria. And in the case of West Falls Church, it's Fairfax County and the city of Falls Church, Metro. So anyway, I just wanted to take the opportunity to indicate that these are real principles that actually work in real life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Snyder. Very much on point. Ms. Gross.
Thank you. I'm reluctant to suggest this, but I think over time we've seen, at least in Northern Virginia, in Fairfax County specifically, some real pushback from the public, from the residential community about what we think should be the future. I'm thinking especially of the West Falls Church Metro stop, Metro station, which has a large parking area around it. And when this is several years ago, when we were looking at developing residential around that station, there were a lot of people who said, oh, no, 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 that's a drive-to station. It needs to remain, a parking lot station so that we don't want all this housing around it because we want to be able to drive to it. There's an education piece for the community that we shouldn't be leaving out in this discussion, I think, because as policymakers, we can have all these wonderful ideas and try to bring them to fruition. But I'm always reminded, if you're leading a parade, you need to look behind you and see if anybody's following you. And I think that this is a situation where we need to incorporate in these efforts the education of the constituency. It's not just the loud voices who say, oh, this is smart growth and we need to do it this way. It's everybody else who might be not quite there. And so we've seen it many, many times. I've been on the board, on many boards long enough to see that we need to incorporate the education of the community so that they can understand why why we think these policies are good. That's not to say that, we won't make some changes, but I really think we need to be careful that we don't, in our zeal to accommodate these ideas for the future, that we're not leaving people behind who just say, stop, just stop.
Thank you. Thank you, Supervisor Gross. And I don't know if you would agree, but I would think that that's an opportunity for COG always to be able to be a source of providing information that may have an opportunity to be viewed as credible by people who are skeptical about how this change might negatively impact them. And we all know our friends at organizations like the Coalition for Smarter Growth, but they may not necessarily be the best conveyors of such a message to people who are inclined to be skeptical. And maybe there's an opportunity for us as COG to come together and do that more effectively.
And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you saying that, because one of COG's mantras over the years has been simple message from many voices. That's what we can do.
Thank you. Okay, seeing other voices in this discussion, Supervisor Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to simply expand upon the discussion that you and Supervisor Gross had. I was trying to think in my mind, how do we garner, how do we put together, and this may be a little remedial, but how do we put together a survey of some sorts to garner that information? I mean, that may sound remedial a little bit, hope not, but that feeds the success of a project like this, I think. And Supervisor Gross, I appreciate you saying that, because I was trying to figure in my mind, how do I say this? Because we want this project to be a sustainable project, and we want them to be long term. When I go back and I think about what Supervisor Lusk was saying, this is a 30-year-old community. I'm experiencing the same kind of thing. And so when we talk about a project such as this, how do we get distinctly feedback, immediate feedback, via survey or whatever, from the community? So thank you for that thought process.
Okay. Thank you, Supervisor Bailey. Can I ask a little bit of a finer point? One of the things that has sometimes come up in conversation, that optimize means something very different, whether you're a sort of an urban core jurisdiction, maybe has a lot of that infrastructure already fundamentally built up and just in need of some tweaking, versus an outer jurisdiction where perhaps the infrastructure does not exist, requires extremely expensive capital investment to achieve. Does that impact how we think about optimizing at all? I know that's somewhat of a leading question, but
I'll chip in on that.
Thank
Ann
you.
Wheeler, Prince William County. That we resemble that remark, right? Because our jurisdiction, we don't have metro, and this comes up all the time. We still need to build roads. I'm so sorry, we have cars, but there just has to be some flexibility. And a great example is we have what we call the Broad Run station at the airport. Okay, great station, but we can't put people right next to the airport for obvious reasons. We can't they don't want us putting people near the airport. And so, we do have something that was like a mile away, and we're talking about autonomous vehicles and sort of a city center, but we just have to be able to have that flexibility to adjust for the fact that we have more of a landmass, and a 2-mile radius is maybe what we need to get people to a certain place, as opposed to walking. And that's just the flexibility that it doesn't mean we can't utilize these and plan for them and get people there, but we just need the flexibility that might not be as tight as an interjurisdiction that can put someone right next to wherever the station is. So.
All right, from one outer jurisdiction in Virginia to one in Maryland, Mr. O'Connor.
Yeah, thank you. I think we share sort of the Prince William mindset a little bit. We love our down county neighbors. We love being in the gravitational pull of the district and the nation's capital, but we aspire to be a destination in and of ourselves as well. And so we want people to come to Frederick, but to do that right now, the only way they can do it is in a car, because the regional mass transit options remain very limited, and there are not inexpensive and frankly realistic long-term solutions to connect the city of Frederick to the metro system in Washington, D.C. Other than by putting, more bus rapid transit on the roads and increasing some highway capacity between Montgomery County and Frederick. But that's not the solution in and of itself. I mean, we want to be a place that develops our own job base and our own housing base, and people can see Frederick as a location that's fully enclosed and fully contained, that's full service in all of these ways, that is part of the Washington and frankly Baltimore metropolitan region in many respects. And so that always remains a challenge, and we want to be supportive in Frederick of what needs to happen to improve transit options in the greater in the greater metro Washington D.C. area, but always have the folks down there recognize that what we need to try and do in Frederick is always going to look a little bit different, because we're that 20 miles between us and Clarksburg, that's real distance in terms of how you make a system work.
Thank you very much. Going to invite Mr. Collins to the conversation.
I'm feeling the love of the outlying counties now in this discussion. I mean, for us, what we've done in anticipation of bringing light rail to the county, the Southern Maryland Rapid Transit Project that extends to the Green Line from White Plains in Charles County, we've tied our long-range land use policy in anticipation of that line actually being put in place. And so we have established an urban redevelopment corridor, as well as a major project, Waldorf Station, that are a part of the proposed alignment that was in place for proposed transit stations. And so we're already thinking in terms of the long-term planning. I know in previous conversations about this, I'd asked whether what we were doing in anticipation made us eligible for much of this discussion. And the response has generally been, we're pretty much in the planning phase, so we're not there. But we certainly see light at the end of the tunnel. The federal government and the state have established direct funding for us to move forward with the NEPA phase of light rail, as well as establishing dedicated funding coming directly from the state and federal government. So we're moving forward, but we're tying our long-term land use planning to the anticipation that we'll see this actually in place.
Terrific. So, I think just to sum up what I'm hearing from this conversation, for sure, what's terrific is that all of your jurisdictions are looking at ways of bringing higher capacity transit modalities to your areas, which is terrific. The way in which you view optimizing, and which we can support you in optimizing, may look a little bit different than walk sheds, bike sheds, and scooter sheds, but for sure they can aid into connectivity, and we will figure out how to organize and plan around that. Thank you all for that conversation. All right, Mr. Elrich.
Just a quick theoretical question. Do you guys have the capacity to analyze, look at master plans and determine what's going to be built out and where, and what's the deficit in terms of what's not going to be built out? If I have to plug holes or decide, everything's not going to fit in Wheaton and Glenmont or whatever, what's the remaining capacity? And then what are the best places to put it? Maybe the best place is a local jurisdictional question. But instead of this, and Chuck knows I get really bothered by this, but when you tell people 200,000 people are coming here and don't tell them that's based on the projections of our own zoning and what you all think is going to be built in 30 years, You create this mass panic, which people manipulate, like your friends that you mentioned earlier, to say, all these people are coming here, what are you going to do? And the truth is, we did a lot of work to plan where these people are coming. So maybe we should analyze, did we get it right? And if we didn't get it right, where are the places to fill the holes, to the point of what's the right place to do this? And what are the places where if it comes there, it's going to be good for us?
Did you want to say something, Mr. Bean? You're muted if you are.
Thank you. I'm going to say generally yes, and then I'm going to look to my colleague Conti to see if he would care to elaborate.
Yeah, thank you. I think Mr. Eldridge's point, there are two aspects to it. At least I try to see two aspects to it. One, the confidence in our projections themselves and doing some sort of a check. What did we project? What was materialized over the past? And then to look at, okay, what are we projecting for the future? And where are the opportunities for them to go? I believe the local planning and zoning have already identified those growth areas, which includes transit-oriented developments, which includes transit-oriented communities. So therefore, an assessment of is there land area for them to go is probably already done as part of the local comprehensive planning. The question I might ask the question slightly differently. Is there better mobility and accessibility and equity achievable if that growth locations are shifted from where they might be to around high capacity transit stations and regional activity centers? So that would take some looking into at a jurisdictional level.
I'd just say that, governments have two different levels of control. At the neighborhood level along George Avenue or whatever, I've got no control over what gets built there. I don't have I know some jurisdictions have empty lots and large shopping centers, but I largely don't. And so every decision about reusing a property is somebody who owns a 6,000 square foot lot. Good luck with that. I absolutely control is the mix of units in these urban centers, the ability to require affordable housing in these urban centers. Everything you want, we control in the places that are scheduled for large scale development. And we have the least control over spreading it out in these small things. So we should think about if you're going to achieve your goal, where are you most likely to achieve it?
Okay. If I could throw out another question here, and just to recap what I'm hearing a little bit, as far as advancing these efforts, jurisdictions should continue to do the work that they're doing on area planning to, figure things out in ways that are consistent with what those jurisdictional values are. We've talked a little bit about what COG can do to better support that effort. I want to just ask if there are other levels of government entities that we feel are useful. Are we looking to states to do something with the way they award or distribute funding? Is there a federal role here?
Transit money.
Money, money, money.
Yes.
And with that, Mark, can I presume that we'd look for opportunities that are less distributed by formula, but more competitive to take advantage of maybe some unique opportunities to advance projects that kind of are doing a multitude of things, achieving equity, sustainability? Like, are we looking for new pots?
I've heard people use the term financing things based on outcomes, rather than, some formula for distribution. I mean, because then people get money who aren't necessarily going to do anything or very much with it. And then people who really need money because they can do large scale things wind up getting deprived. It might inspire other people to be more imaginative about what they do to get money, but it would help people who are ready to move, like you guys, like your project in Fairfax or our BRT system. We're still waiting. I got my first money from the state for BRT this year, if you can imagine that.
Excellent.
This is a 12-year project at this point.
All right. Anything else that we're looking for in terms of support, Supervisor Bailey?
Mr. Chairman, I think your idea about the funding piece is essential because we just, I mean, the traditional funding sources are they're still there, but you know, in a world of COVID coming out, you know, what does that look like now? Where are there other opportunities in terms of grant funding or whatever? We just don't know. Maybe some of my seasoned colleagues here may know, but I don't know. So I think that's imperative that we look at that.
Okay. Supervisor Gross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In our zeal to look for financing from the state or other entities, I would, at least from a Virginia perspective, I'd be very reluctant to hope for a whole lot because the challenge for us in Virginia often is there'll be some sort of funding available, but I don't want the General Assembly to get involved in local government authorities to regulate and address land use. And this, you know, we've had those situations in Richmond where the General Assembly says, oh no, we don't get involved in land use. And then they dabble in it and take away our authorities and force us to do certain things. So let's be real careful. Now, maybe that's a Virginia issue and not something that they have to deal with in Maryland, but we sure have to deal with it here in Virginia. So let's be a little careful about that ripple effect that sometimes happens. We do not want to give up our local land use authority or any amount of money, I would suspect.
Indeed. We also know when the circumstances are right, even the Commonwealth of Virginia can join together to create some substantial investments in transportation, which are leading to the potential for some great outcomes and are directly facilitating WMATA's 10-year plan. So point well taken. All right, I am going to just wrap this up and then invite Vice Chair Stewart to make a closing comment. But what I'm taking away from this conversation, not to be reductionist, but COG should continue to figure out how it can continue to provide the credible and objective basis to support the efforts towards transit-oriented communities being optimized to the fullest extent possible, mindful of all of the differences in jurisdictions and regional positioning, that jurisdictions themselves should continue their work on area planning to do this in a way that reflects the local flavor, and that we will really encourage and seek opportunities for there to be, I love that language, Mr. Elrich, outcome funding opportunities for those of us who were able to demonstrate projects and efforts that, you know, meet clear priority goals, whether they be equity, sustainability, et cetera. So this is a really great conversation. I think it's been helpful in furthering some direction, and I'll leave it to Vice Chair Stewart for the last word.
Great. Thank you, Chair Dorsey. I just wanted to do a final plug for the Racial Equity Learning Series. As I listened to our conversation over the last half hour, and particularly Supervisor Bailey and Supervisor Gross, the points you made about making sure that we're listening to our communities and engaging them. I think the racial equity work that we're going to be doing on May 20th, and then if folks go on to join the cohort, is going to be essential as we do this work in our community. So I hope people can join us on May 20th and some for the whole series. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Vice Chair Stewart. Is there any additional business that anyone would like to bring before the board this afternoon? Well, seeing none, I hope that we can see everyone in person when we next meet, which is May 11th, and one of the featured items on the agenda will be hearing more about WMATA's Joint Development Strategic Plan. We will, of course, have other interesting topics on our agenda. I thank everybody for their robust participation and discussion today. We are officially adjourned. Enjoy the 80-degree weather.
Sounds good.